Almost everyone knows the battles of Cannes and Adrianople. They were epical events that are hard to miss. But if the epic itself is saturated with such events that one enumeration of them with finger-curling would require the help of more than one and not two people, it is not surprising that one event, very important, can simply be lost. This is exactly what happened with the Battle of Arausione, the bloodiest battle in Roman history, the battle that determined the fate of the Republic, although it did not seem so at the time. 105th year before Christ. Italy is in panic. In Africa for the 7th year is inglorious Jugurtha War. Gaius Marius drives on the sands of the Numidians, and no one knows whether he himself will not be a victim of his own ambitions, like all the previous commanders. But Jugurtha is no longer the main problem. Almost simultaneously with the rebellion of the Numidian king, Rome faced a threat long forgotten, the possibility of a barbarian invasion of Italy. The tribes of the Samurs and Teutons, driven by constant hunger, began their journey from northern Europe to more favorable habitats. They did not want to go to war with Rome, but it so happened that the mere threat of a huge horde devouring everything in its path on the borders of the empire made the Romans decide to preemptively end the threat. A threat that, at that moment, was itself afraid of the Romans and was, for the time being, trying to simply pass them by. A threat that, because of the arrogance, incompetence, stupidity, and greed of Roman politicians and military leaders, had gone from potentially dangerous to catastrophic. For consular armies in 6 years were destroyed, tens of thousands of Romans died, including senators and even consuls, and after the final defeat, the barbarians held the surviving Romans under a yoke, which was the greatest humiliation. The Romans themselves, by their own actions, deprived the barbarians of fear of them, and now the horde, scattered across Gaul and Spain, was preparing to attack the territory of Rome for the first time. But the Romans were also preparing to repel the threat. Throughout Italy was carried out a large-scale mobilization, collected all the reserves, what is possible. In the north of Italy operated 2 armies, Proconsul Quintus Servilius Scipiona and Consul Gnaeus Mallia Maximus, a total of 110,000, including 40,000 personnel. Against them advanced about 200,000 barbarians. What were the Romans hoping for? That they are barbarians and iron discipline of Roman legions they are not familiar with. The reason for previous defeats lay in the fact that the Romans allowed or catch themselves on the march, or made gross errors in the choice of the place of battle. But Quintus Servilius Scipio was not so simple. A respected nobile, he was the hope of the nascent optimatist party to keep the Republic from sliding ever further into the chaos of populism. The coming battle was Quintus' chance to become a figure of equal stature to the savior of the Republic, Scipio Africanus. And with such authority no people's tribune would dare to say a word against his reforms. Yes, he spoiled his reputation a little at the beginning of the year, when after Tolosa for violation of the alliance treaty he lost all the gold and silver he had requisitioned in the city. But now the Eternal City is whispering about the mysterious disappearance of several tons of precious metals, and after his victory, no one will remember about it. If anyone was too talkative, small bribes could silence them. The plan was a good one, if it weren't for one problem. The consul Mallius Maximus, who officially had a higher status than the proconsul, refused to obey Scipian's orders. Mallius, who had no military experience, should have handed over overall command to the more experienced Scipian. But he did not show proper respect for the noble patrician Scipian and his experience, refused to unite forces under his command. And so the 2 armies stood in separate camps, and the proconsul showed his reciprocal disrespect for Mallius. The final point was that the barbarians, who had sent ambassadors to negotiate, first turned to Consul Mallius, which infuriated Scipian, and he provoked the barbarians to launch an attack. Arrogance, incompetence, stupidity, and greed. Because of his ambition, Scipian failed to see that his actions were leading to disaster, not only on the battlefield but also in Rome. The barbarians separately first defeated Scipian's troops, and then Mallius. More than 100,000 soldiers and carriers died in the battle. This was more than at Cannae, a battle which the Romans remembered as one of their greatest disgraces. But there they were outplayed by Hannibal himself, and here by a mob of barbarians. Arausian catastrophe on losses will be able to overtake all previous and future defeats of the Romans, and will cause unprecedented shifts in the Republic itself. Although the perpetrator of the defeat, Scipion, manages to avoid death and returns to Rome, his career is over. On his return to the city, he will be condemned to exile. All of Italy was shocked by the severity of the defeat. After all, there were no more troops between the barbarians and Rome. The only able-bodied army was under the command of Mary in Africa, and, most importantly, it was winning. Therefore, without asking the Senate, the commissions, without the presence of Marius himself, elected him consul and gave him command in Italy. This was a disregard of all the legal rules and traditions of the Republic. And while the offense of nominating a candidate not through the Senate and without serving the 10-year interval between consulships could be justified by the precedent of Scipio Aemilianus, nomination to the consulship without the personal participation of the candidate had previously been impossible. Arausian pushed the boundaries of what was possible, allowing not just the violation of many of the foundations of the Republic, but making those violations the norm. By taking advantage of the threat of the barbarians, Marius would ensure himself 5 years of consistent occupation of the consulship. Marius's victories allowed him to push the limits of what was possible for him even further, to pass hitherto unthinkable laws through the comitia and senate, and to gradually gather around him a powerful support group of those disgruntled with the nobilite. He could not get the eternal consulship without an external threat. It was military victories that brought him to the leadership chair, not the reform program. But it is possible to do without it, becoming a gray cardinal of Roman politics, promoting through his popular tribunes the bills he needs. And if the political instruments of struggle are not enough, you can always use sticks, another know-how of Roman political life, introduced allied to Marius' people's tribune Saturninus. Yes, Marius was wrong in the end. He bet too long on the two independent Saturninus, who played his own game. The Nobilite party did not even have to act in the open. It only needed to push Saturninus and Marius together. And to do this was simple, forcing Saturninus to go the way of Gaius Gracchus and organize a small rebellion in the city, which had to suppress Marius. Any outcome of this intrigue did not bode well for Marius. He would be forced to suppress the performance of Saturninus and lose some of his authority among the plebs. It was a clearly calibrated blow, weakening the position of Marius. But it was still impossible to remove him completely, just as it was impossible to repair the institutions he had broken. If Scipion had won at Arausione, Marius would have returned to Rome after the end of the war with Jugurtha merely as a successful military commander. There would not have been his fivefold consulship, nor such a serious increase in the influence of the popular tribunes, nor a decline in political culture and respect for tradition. And reforms similar to the later Sullan reforms might have taken root, for the institutions on which it relied would not have degenerated so severely. But now the Republic had no other way, for it had Gaius Marius, its savior and one of its gravediggers, and it was waiting for another chance. And this chance was given by the same Arausian. After all, on the fields under him died not only Romans, but also Italians, who made up to half of the army. Italics and before were dissatisfied with their unequal position with the Romans. They waged wars together shared the risks, but most of the profits received the Eternal City. Before the Cimro-Teutonic War and Arausione, the Italians had no reason to demand something more for themselves, but now they did, for it was because of the incompetence, self-confidence, stupidity, and greed of the respected Romans that tens of thousands of them died. Italians, led to slaughter by talentless Roman politicians willing to lay down tens and hundreds of thousands for the sake of their own ambitions. And now the Italians wanted compensation for their bloodshed. Roman citizenship? Before Arausione, the question of citizenship for Italians had come up once, when Gaius Gracchus wanted to give mere Latin citizenship to Italians. But the question of citizenship was one of the few common ground in the views of the plebs and the nobility. Equalizing the rights of Italics and Romans threatened the position of the latter. Therefore, when, after the end of the war with the barbarians, Italians began first to ask and then to demand citizenship, they were invariably answered. It was out of the question. Respected senators preferred not to notice the problem. They will not go to war against us? And if they do, the Roman legions will quickly put them in their place. No one cancel, divide, and rule. The Romans were not embarrassed by the fact that Italians themselves increasingly showed unanimity in the struggle for citizenship and the emergence of political leaders in this movement. To apply divide and conquer, Rome needed to be a more acceptable ally than other Italics. But here comes the problem. This alliance was now acceptable only if it was allowed in the politics of Rome. And an Italic revolt could even pay dividends for certain politicians. Marius, for example. Of course, there were those who saw the impending storm. For example, the reformers among the nobile optimates gathered around the popular tribune Marcus Livius Drusus. But their attempt to pass a law granting Roman citizenship to Italics in a package with other reforms that would have stabilized the Republic's rickety system of government failed. There are different versions as to why. One theory is that his collusion with the Italics was uncovered. Another is that he simply lost support in the popular assembly because of dissatisfaction with his bills. But Drusus at least tried to stop the inevitable. His assassination by an unknown assassin at the very end of the tribunate destroyed the Italics' last hopes of resolving the citizenship problem by peaceful means. There is an unconfirmed hypothesis that Drusus, as well as his friend and co-leader of the Italics, Quintus Popedius Silon, both took part in the Battle of Arausione. But even if this was not the case, without the defeat at Arausione in any case, the Italic vote might not have risen to a call to stand up for their rights in arms. This would have postponed the urgency of the question and given time for an attempt to find a compromise. But it did not. It was during the Allied War, the Romans, for the sake of keeping the economy afloat, will begin to collect even more taxes from the provinces, which will take advantage of Mithridates Eupator, whose rise will be the trigger for the conflict between Maria and Sulla. It is the heated Allied War will return again in the big politics of Maria and will confront him with Sulla. Their struggle would sweep away the last vestiges of the old Republican framework in the ensuing Civil War, and the beautiful Republic of the future that Sulla would try to build on the ruins would survive for barely a dozen years. And it was during the Allied War that Pompey's star would first shine, taking advantage of the fact that the old framework had collapsed, and the new one held only on the authority of individuals, not the system itself. It is Pompey who will then destroy Sulla's legacy for his own ambitions. And all this because of one lost battle, whose name the Romans tried to forget.